Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In previous lectures, we talked about some of the early skirmishes in the Revolutionary War, and we talked about documents like Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence, which helped to motivate the colonies fully behind the idea of fighting this war of rebellion against England. In this lecture and those that follow, we're going to talk about the actual combat of the Revolutionary War and the process by which the colonies managed to defeat what at one time appeared a nearly unbeatable foe, the British Army. As the Revolutionary War began, the British seemed to possess advantages that would be insurmountable for the colonial army. The British Army and Navy were both massive and experienced and battle-tested over a series of wars stretching out for nearly a century leading up to the Revolutionary War. The British Army outnumbered the American colonial forces by about 2-1, but as we'll see in a moment, the colonial army was much less experienced and not as well supplied, and so the number of advantages early in the war might have felt even greater. The British combat expedition was consistently well financed and well supplied throughout the war as well. And yet, as we know now, the British don't wind up winning this war, and so they did confront some challenges, even though early on it appeared they had the advantage. Their supply lines throughout this enterprise were stretched. They were fighting a war all the way across an ocean. As we will see, that war eventually becomes a multi-front war. They wind up fighting more than just the Americans. Over the course of this process, they will ultimately be fighting against the French, the Spanish, and others before the war is done. We might also begin to wonder how motivated British forces were as this war stretched on. Recall, wars are fought by soldiers, and those individual British soldiers, after they had been across the ocean for several years fighting out in the American countryside, might have begun to wonder, what was all of this about? Why were they subjecting themselves to this? And British motivation may have sagged as the war dragged on over months and even years. At the outset of the war, the colonial army confronted lots of disadvantages, but they did have some things going for them. For one thing, they were fighting a war on their home turf. And I don't mean that only in the sense of kind of knowledge of the countryside, although that did play a role in some instances. But I think fighting in their own country provided the Continental Army and those soldiers a motivation that the British Army just could never match. The British forces are fighting all the way across an ocean in a faraway land. Meanwhile, the Continental Army is fighting literally in their own towns, in their own yards, and on their own farms in some cases. And so they're powerfully motivated to hold on to that land. They're also motivated by the overarching ideals of the revolution, the idea of liberty and independence and freedom and equality. The Continental troops are powerfully motivated throughout this conflict. As we'll see, the Continental Army also engages in both conventional and non-conventional warfare, which again plays into the idea of home turf. Washington and his men fairly early in the war realized that fighting a conventional war, that is large kind of set-piece battles out on an open battlefield against the British, was not as likely to wind up in success as fighting what we might call today guerrilla-style warfare, hiding in the woods, launching surprise attacks, and then going back into hiding before they could really be successfully counterattacked. So we'll talk about some of those methods as this discussion goes on, but the British found it very difficult at times to win battles against this sort of non-conventional fighting. Saying that, though, the Continental Army confronted a number of disadvantages as the war began. Compared to the British, these soldiers were far less experienced and in some cases had no experience at all. Many of them were simply farmers and citizens coming from their farms and out of their towns to join the cause, but they had to be trained from nothing to become soldiers in this war. That takes time. The Continental Army also confronted throughout the war a persistent lack of supplies, lack of munitions, and the kinds of things they needed to be successful. As we will discuss shortly, there were times in the war where these kind of challenges threatened to snuff out the colonial effort before it could even really get going. One of the great things that George Washington is celebrated for in this war is simply holding his army together and keeping them in the field when there were definitely times when it looked like the whole army might just sort of evaporate and desert around him. We'll talk about those factors in just a minute. We're going to talk first about the war in the North, which is where most of the intense conflict was concentrated over the first months and even years of the war. So after those initial skirmishes at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, the British began to settle in for what they realized would be a much longer and sustained conflict. They chose New York as their initial stronghold. There was a heavier loyalist population in New York. But of course, at the outset of the conflict, the Colonials and Washington's forces held New York. But the British concentrated their attacks there, and Washington suffered defeats at Brooklyn Heights in August of 1776 and then in Manhattan itself. And so Washington's forces were forced to retreat across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where they also kind of hunkered down for a longer conflict. As that fall began to head into winter, Washington began to realize that the militiamen around him could be incredibly unreliable. They would drift away, in some cases deserting the effort altogether, in other cases going away for a few weeks and returning for a few weeks. But Washington really struggled to know with any certainty what kind of troops he was going to have around him at any given time. And he really confronted this lack of discipline and lack of commitment to the cause through much of the war. In the winter of 1776, our man Thomas Paine wrote an inspirational essay called The American Crisis, and the most famous lines of that essay read, "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women." This is the idea of the so-called winter soldier, the man who is willing to tough it out through the bitter, cold, hard months of winter is truly the soldier that deserves our praise and recognition. And those were exactly the kind of troops that Washington put to the test in that winter of 1776. He understood that despite the long odds, his men and the Continental Army in general needed a victory to begin to turn the tide and just give themselves some motivation. And so he launched a daring and surprise attack on Christmas night of 1776. Under cover of darkness, his men crossed the partially frozen Delaware River and attacked an outpost manned by Hessian troops, German mercenaries, at Trenton, winning a surprise victory in the dead of night. A week later, this was followed by another victory at Princeton, and the painting you see here depicts George Washington at the victory at Princeton. At this point, Washington began to realize that his primary motivation was not necessarily in winning huge battles and taking huge chunks of territory from the British, but rather just staying alive, keeping the army together, launching surprise attacks, kind of pestering the British, and eventually wearing down their motivation, a strategy that over the long term is going to pay great dividends. Despite those surprising victories by the Continental troops at Trenton and Princeton, the British still held the momentum through these early months of the year, and really the first year to 18 months of the war was a series of British victories, many of them substantial. Not only the city of New York fell to the British, but in 1777, Philadelphia also fell to the British, and many other sites as well. It was not until the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York when Colonial General Horatio Gates managed to pull out a surprise victory over British forces at Saratoga that the Continental troops really had their first major morale boost. And more consequential than that, the colonial victory at Saratoga was enough to convince the French that they should put their resources and support behind the colonial effort against their longtime arch rivals, the British. And so it's not long after this that we're going to start to see French aid beginning to pour into the colonial effort, and it really makes a huge difference. Despite that swing in momentum, it took a while for French aid to arrive and for the colonial troops to really start to turn the tide. And so the winter of 1777 to 78 was a notoriously harsh one for the colonial forces under Washington, who quartered at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania in the midst of blizzards and bitter cold and harsh deprivation of all kinds of resources, barely managing to hang on during that winter. And yet the following year is when the war begins to turn a bit more in the favor of the colonial army. The French aid starts actively arriving in North America in March of 1778. And so now the French are combining their resources and their troops behind the Continental forces. Not long after that, Spain joined the war as well against their rivals, the British. And so at that point, Britain found itself fighting a war on many fronts. In fact, they were fighting not only in North America, but in the Caribbean. Remember, there were many very valuable colonies in the Caribbean, and back in the old continent of Europe itself. And so fighting this war on so many different fronts ultimately is going to wear down the British. Their forces are divided, their resources are divided, and ultimately the Continental Army is going to be able to turn the tide in large part because the British had so many other things that they were forced to confront.